My name is Frederick Setskorn and I'm in year 6.2. I'm going to be talking about a famous British Antarctic explorer named Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton. I made a thing about his last name. It's a really strong last name. Shackle plus 1 ton equals Shackleton. Okay. Slide 1, Introduction. Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton was a polar explorer who led 3 British expeditions to the Antarctic and was one of the most important people of the period known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. After Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole in December 1911, Shackleton wanted to be the first to cross the Antarctic from sea to sea, passing through the pole. He failed in his attempt and died a couple of years later. This brings us to a very important question. Why did Ernest Shackleton become even more famous than the man who beat him to the pole? Slide 2, Timeline. Shackleton undertook 3 Antarctic expeditions and his first trip to polar regions was as 3rd officer on Captain Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery expedition from 1901 to 1904, named after the ship Discovery. He took part in a trip to reach the South Pole, and they reached the highest possible latitude at 82 degrees and 17 seconds recorded up to that date. He became very ill during the return and was sent home shortly after they reached the ship. His second trip was in 1907 when he returned to Antarctica as leader of the Nimrod expedition, named after the ship Nimrod. Slide 2, Timeline. In January 1909, he and 3 companions traveled south and created a record farthest south latitude at 88 degrees and 23 seconds, which was only 97 geographical miles, 180 kilometers from the South Pole, and by far the closest that anyone up to that time in history had come to the South Pole. When he returned home, Shackleton was made a knight by King Edward VII for his achievement. After the race to the South Pole ended in December 1911 when Roald Amundsen reached the pole, Shackleton wanted to become the first to cross Antarctica from sea to sea, passing through the pole. On August 8th, 1914, just as the First World War started, Shackleton set out with a ship named the Endurance for what became the Imperial Trans-Arctic Expedition. Slide 3, Imperial Trans-Arctic Expedition from 1914 to 1917. The Endurance left South Georgia for Antarctica in December 1914. The plan was to land at Vassal Bay and then cross the frozen continent through the pole to the Ross Sea. Within 2 days, the Endurance had entered the pack ice of the Weddell Sea. By 19th January 1915, the Endurance was firmly trapped in the pack ice and was forced to drift with the flow. The ship reached the furthest point south that she would reach in February. Attempts to cut through the pack ice failed, and the men kept their morale high by playing games and singing songs. The ship drifted nearly 800 miles north, still trapped in the pack ice. By the end of October 1915, the Endurance has been crushed by millions of tons of ice and finally sank on 21st November 1915. The men made a camp on the pack ice and waited. Slide 4. Ice to Elephant Island to South Georgia. They called their temporary camp Peyton's Camp and continued to drift on the pack ice until it split in March 1916. They saw Elephant Island on 7th April. On 9th April, the 28 men put the Endurance's 3 lifeboats in the sea and set off for Elephant Island. After 7 very difficult days and 100 miles, they safely reached Elephant Island and was able to stand on land for the first time in 16 months. There was very little food on the island and no ships passed nearby, so Shackleton decided to sail for South Georgia with 5 men in one of the lifeboats. On 24th April 1916, Shackleton launched a 23-foot lifeboat in an attempt to cross 800 miles of sea during the South and Atlantic winter. The 6 men had to fight against strong winds, huge waves, and rain and freezing cold for 17 days, believing in their basic navigational skills not to miss the island. On 10th May, they landed on the south of the island and completed one of the most incredible boat journeys in history. Slide 5, back to Elephant Island. Shackleton and 2 men set off with enough food for 3 days to cross the island on foot. They had to climb over mountains, and they reached the whaling station on the other side 36 hours later, not even stopping to sleep. It took 4 attempts over the next 3 months with the ship Yeleko to reach the men still trapped at Elephant Island. Finally, during the 4th attempt, they reached them and found everybody alive and in good spirits. Slide 6, images of the epic journey. Here is Shackleton's crew, and there is the Endurance trapped in the pack ice. And these little hills, there are ropes attached to it, and it has a way to the Peyton's camp so they don't get lost in storms. And here's the Endurance being crushed. There's the few men in the lifeboat setting off from Elephant Island. And there's some of his crew pulling one of the lifeboats on Elephant Island. There's them at the beach, I think. There's some of his crew waving. Yeah, because they're rescued. And there's a few penguins, I think, on Elephant Island. And there's his crew again. Slide 7. Why did Shackleton become famous? Shackleton's brave attempt to save all the lives of his men was quickly forgotten because he failed to cross the Antarctic. Later in the 20th century, Shackleton was rediscovered and became a role model for leadership, mainly because he always put his men's safety first, and he was able to keep his team together in an incredible survival story. Slide 8, Shackleton's impact. In 2001, a book was written called Shackleton's Way, Leadership Lessons from the Great Antarctic Explorer, which has become a guide for many business leaders today. Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton's brave attempt to save his men and his leadership qualities made him the 11th most important person in Britain's history. His family's motto has become world famous and are used by many today. By endurance we conquer. Slide 9, references. Here are some of the online sources where I found all my information.